Hey guys, tonight we're going on a little historical field trip. And trust me, you'll want to pack light because the social climbing in our destination was intense. We're not talking about knights in shining armor or pharaohs building pyramids. Oh no. Tonight we're diving headfirst into the very peculiar, very opulent, and frankly, very dramatic world of Gilded Age New York. Imagine a city bustling with horse-drawn carriages, gas lamps flickering to life at dusk, and new money practically raining from the sky like a ticker-tape parade, while old money clutched their pearls tighter than a miser counting pennies. It's a time when you could become absurdly wealthy overnight, but you couldn't buy your way into the right dinner party, not without a fight. Think of it as the ultimate reality TV show, but with more costs and less direct yelling. The passive aggression was truly an art form. You might even find yourself wondering if you survived the first day without committing a major social faux pas. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment below and let me know what city you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I always love seeing where you all are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. The year is roughly 1870. The American Civil War has just wrapped up, and the whole country, especially the North, is experiencing an economic boom unlike anything seen before. You're standing on Fifth Avenue in New York City, and it's less a street and more a stage for a grand, ongoing play about wealth. New York isn't just growing, it's exploding. Skyscrapers aren't a thing yet, but mansions are. Everywhere you look, there's the clang of hammers, the smell of fresh plaster, and the chatter of ambitious men and women with eyes full of dollar signs. This isn't the quiet, charming little port city it once was. It's a roaring, clattering, smoke-belching beast of commerce and ambition. This period, from the 1870s to about the turn of the 20th century, is famously known as the Gilded Age. The term itself, coined by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner in their satirical novel, The Gilded Age, a tale of today, perfectly encapsulates the era. They didn't call it the Golden Age, mind you. It was gilded, meaning thinly covered with gold. On the surface, it was all glittering prosperity, incredible innovation, and astounding wealth. But underneath that shiny, veneer layer, there were often layers of poverty, corruption, and intense social stratification. And tonight, we're going to peel back that gold leaf and see what was really going on beneath. Oh, say, the sheer scale of wealth being generated was mind-boggling. Think about the railroads stretching across the continent, factories churning out goods at an unprecedented rate, mining operations pulling vast fortunes from the earth, and financial markets booming like never before. Men like Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jay Gould, Andrew Carnegie, and John D. Rockefeller were accumulating fortunes that would make today's billionaires blush. They weren't just rich, they were stupid rich, with enough money to buy small European countries if they felt like it. And with all that money came a desire for something more. Social acceptance, status, and recognition from the people who had been somebody for generations. This is where the tension begins to simmer. Imagine yourself as one of these newly minted millionaires. You've got the biggest house on Fifth Avenue, more carriages than you know what to do with, and enough diamonds to rival a royal treasury. But when you try to send your daughter to the right finishing school or get your wife an invitation to the right charity ball, you find the doors politely, but firmly, shut in your face. Why? Because there ain't no money. Your wealth is loud. Your manners are perhaps a little unpolished, at least in the eyes of the established elite. And your family tree doesn't stretch back to colonial times or, even better, to European aristocracy. And this wasn't just some vague feeling of being excluded. It was a deeply ingrained system. The old money families of New York, who had made their fortunes in shipping, real estate, or banking over generations, viewed these nouveau rich with a mixture of disdain and thinly veiled panic. Their world, stable and predictable for decades, was being shaken to its core by these brash, ambitious newcomers. The social order, once as rigid as a corset bone, was under threat, and that threat wasn't coming from political upheaval or economic collapse. It was coming from within, from the very nature of American opportunity. One quirky detail that illustrates this era's obsession with appearances. Did you know that during this time, even the most mundane items like silverware or doorknobs were often intricately designed and seen as status symbols? It wasn't just about owning things, but about owning the right things and having them displayed in the right way. People would even commission elaborate family crests for their carriages or stationery, even if their ancestors were barely a generation removed from digging ditches. It was all part of the performance of having arrived. However, it's worth noting that historians still debate just how unified and impenetrable this old money elite truly was. Was it a solid block, or were there always internal divisions and subtle hierarchies even among the established families? Some argue that American society, by its very nature, always had a degree of fluidity, and the Gilded Age was just a particularly flashy period of rapid change, rather than an absolute social lockout. But one thing is for certain, for those on the outside looking in, the walls felt incredibly high, and the gatekeepers were formidable. And the fight to get past them, as we'll see, was the social battleground of the century. Now let's talk about how all this money, this torrent of cash that fundamentally reshaped New York City, actually came to be. It wasn't just magic, though for some of these guys, it probably felt like it. We're talking about the Industrial Revolution hitting warp speed in America, especially after the Civil War. Before that, wealth was often tied to land, shipping, or established mercantile ventures. It was generational, slow growing, and frankly, a bit predictable. But then, boom, the world decided it needed steel, oil, and, most importantly, railroads. And a few incredibly sharp, incredibly ruthless, and sometimes incredibly lucky individuals were perfectly positioned to make absolute fortunes from these new necessities. Imagine you're reliving through this time. You wake up one morning, and suddenly, the landscape is changing at an astonishing pace. Gigantic factories are springing up, belching smoke, yes, but also churning out goods that everyone suddenly needs. There's a frantic energy in the air. People are talking about oil wells gushing black gold in Pennsylvania, about steel mills lighting up the night sky in Pittsburgh, and about iron rails stretching across the entire continent, connecting coasts and creating a truly national market. If you were smart, fast, and not afraid to elbow a few people out of the way, your ship, or more accurately, your train, had definitely come in. Take the railroads, for instance. Before them, transportation was slow, cumbersome, and expensive. Suddenly, you could move goods and people across vast distances in days instead of weeks or months. This wasn't just a business. It was the nervous system of a rapidly expanding nation. And the men who controlled these lines, the railroad barons, became unimaginably rich. We're talking about fortunes built on iron, steam, and sheer, unadulterated ambition. You could literally buy up small, disconnected rail lines, link them together, and suddenly control a vast network, dictating prices and squeezing out competitors. It was a wild, wild west, but with locomotives instead of horses. Then there was oil. Before the Gilded Age, oil was mostly used for lamps. But with the invention of the internal combustion engine and the increasing demand for lubricants and fuel, it became liquid gold. John D. Rockefeller, a man whose name still whispers wealth today, didn't just drill for oil. Oh no, he realized the real money was in refining and transportation. He systematically bought up refineries, established pipelines, and pretty much cornered the market on refined oil. You bought his kerosene, or you lived in the dark. It was that simple, and he did it with a quiet, almost terrifying efficiency that would make modern CEOs weep with envy. He wasn't flashy, but his fortune was truly colossal. And let's not forget steel. Andrew Carnegie, who started from incredibly humble beginnings as a bobbin boy in a cotton factory, saw the future in steel. Steel was needed for rails, for bridges, for buildings, for everything. He applied principles of efficiency on vertical integration, controlling every step from the mines to the finished product. He was obsessed with cutting costs and increasing output, and in doing so, he built an empire that made him one of the richest men in history. You might have heard his name associated with libraries and concert halls today, because he famously gave away nearly all of his wealth. But first, he accumulated it on a scale that was simply staggering. What's truly fascinating, and perhaps a little unsettling, is the speed at which these fortunes accumulated. It wasn't a gradual process over centuries. It was a furious explosion of wealth in a single generation or two. Imagine going from being a ferry operator, like Cornelius Vanderbilt's early career, to owning an entire rail system that spans states, or from a modest grain merchant, like Rockefeller, to controlling the world's oil supply. It was like winning the lottery every single day for years, but instead of luck, it was often shrewd business acumen, relentless drive, and, let's be honest, a fair bit of sharp practice and monopolistic behavior that wouldn't fly today. One quirky little detail about these early fortunes. Many of these industrial titans started with incredibly simple, almost mundane ideas, but scaled them up to an unimaginable degree. For instance, before oil was king, whale oil was the primary source of illumination. The discovery of petroleum suddenly made the entire whaling industry seem quaint and inefficient. Imagine the old whalers looking at these new oil barons with a mix of bewilderment and perhaps a healthy dose of resentment. It was a complete paradigm shift, and those who saw it coming, or better yet, created it, were the ones who reshaped the financial landscape. It's a bit like someone today finding a way to harness energy from, say, perfectly folded laundry and becoming a trillionaire overnight. Unlikely, but you get the idea. Now historians still widely debate the rags to riches narrative that often surrounds these figures. While many, like Carnegie, did indeed start with very little, others, like J.P. Morgan and banking, came from already established, well-connected families. Was it truly an era of pure meritocracy where anyone could climb to the top if they worked hard enough? Or did pre-existing connections, access to capital, and sometimes less than ethical business practices play a more significant role in their meteoric rise? It's a nuanced discussion, but what's undeniable is the sheer, unprecedented scale of wealth accumulation and its concentration in the hands of a relative few. And these few, with their newly minted billions, were about to knock on the doors of New York's established elite, whether those doors were open or not. This massive infusion of new money was about to collide head-on with the deeply entrenched old money, setting the stage for some truly epic social fireworks. Alright, so we've seen the tsunami of new money crashing into New York. Now, let's talk about what it crashed into. Imagine a fortress, built not of stone and mortar, but of generations of inherited wealth, strict social codes, and an unspoken belief in their own inherent superiority. This was the world of old money New York, and its most formidable walls were embodied by families like the Astors, the Livingstones, the Stuyvesants, and the Goylettes. These weren't just rich families, they were entrenched families, with roots in the city stretching back to the colonial era, often tracing their lineage to Dutch settlers or prominent British merchants who had established themselves centuries ago. You see, for these families, wealth wasn't something you made, it was something you had. It was inherited, passed down from one generation to the next, often through real estate holdings in Manhattan that had multiplied in value exponentially. The Astors, in particular, were masters of this game. John Jacob Astor, the patriarch, started his fortune in the fur trade in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, but he shrewdly invested almost all of it into New York City real estate. He bought up vast tracts of undeveloped land in Manhattan, understanding that as the city grew, so too would his family's wealth. And boy, did it grow. By the Gilded Age, the Astor family controlled an astonishing amount of prime Manhattan property, making them literally richer than Croesus without having to lift a finger in a factory or on a railroad. For the old money families, their status washed about how many new factories they owned or how many miles of railroad track they controlled. It was about their pedigree. It was about their family name appearing in the right ledgers, their ancestors having fought in the Revolution on the winning side, of course, and their summer homes being in Newport, Rhode Island, rather than some upstart new resort. They believed in a quieter, more understated display of wealth, often referred to as stealth wealth today. While the new money might build a marble palace overnight, the old money lived in stately brownstones that had been in the family for decades, filled with ancestral portraits and antique furniture that whispered stories of generations past. Their power wasn't just financial, it was social. They controlled the most prestigious social clubs, the most exclusive charities, and, crucially, the guest lists of the most coveted balls and dinner parties. These weren't just gatherings. They were rites of passage, affirmations of status, and battlegrounds where reputations were made or shattered. Being excluded from these events wasn't just a snub. It was a public declaration that you simply didn't belong, no matter how many millions you had stashed in your vault. Imagine trying to break into this circle. It's like trying to get into an incredibly exclusive club where the only entry requirement is having been born into it. You might have all the money in the world, but if your grandmother wasn't friends with their grandmother, you were simply out of luck. There was an unspoken code, a set of manners and traditions that only those who had grown up immersed in them truly understood. Everything from how you paid a social call to the correct way to hold a teacup was scrutinized. A single misstep could mark you as common and seal your fate outside the velvet ropes. One fascinating, if slightly bizarre, detail about old money in their homes. Many old money families in New York were notoriously resistant to installing modern conveniences like electricity or indoor plumbing, not because they couldn't afford it, but because they considered it vulgar or newfangled. Imagine still using gas lamps and outdoor privies in your multi-million-dollar mansion simply because your ancestors did. Of course, this is a bit of an exaggeration, and eventually, most adopted these conveniences, but it highlights their general aversion to anything that smacked of progress for the sake of progress, especially if it was associated with the brash new rich. They valued tradition and continuity above all else. However, historians still debate the true extent to which these old money families were truly a monolithic block. While the Astors were undeniably at the top, there were always subtle pecking orders and drive orders, even within the established elite. Some old money families might have been more open to new blood, or at least strategically receptive, than others. It wasn't always a perfectly united front, though it often appeared that way to those on the outside trying to break in. Yet, the perception of their unwavering exclusivity was very real, and it formed the ultimate barrier for anyone without the right surname or the right lineage. So, while the new industrialists were busy building empires of steel and oil, the old guard was meticulously maintaining their social castles, polishing their generational silver, and drawing invisible lines in the sand, daring anyone without the proper credentials to cross them. The stage was now set for the ultimate clash of cultures. Raw, booming new wealth against refined, inherited tradition. And at the heart of this conflict was a woman who embodied the very essence of old money power. Someone who held the keys to social acceptance in New York City with an iron grip. Her name was Mrs. Caroline Astor, and she was about to become the gatekeeper of a very exclusive kingdom. Alright, so we've painted a picture of the old money fortress. Now, let's talk about its queen, the woman who stood at the very top of New York society, wielding a power far more formidable than any political office. Mrs. Caroline Astor. You might have heard the name Astor before, associated with incredible wealth. But Caroline Schermerhorn Astor was the ultimate social arbiter, the undisputed empress of Gilded Age New York. She wasn't just wealthy, she defined wealth, taste, and who truly belonged. If she didn't know you, or more accurately, if she didn't approve of you, you simply didn't exist in the upper echelons of New York society. Imagine a woman who radiated an aura of quiet authority, impeccable breeding, and an almost regal presence. Mrs. Astor was born into an old, respected Dutch-American family, the Schermerhorns, and then married into the Astor family, effectively combining two immense fortunes and two venerable pedigrees. This cemented her position at the absolute pinnacle. She wasn't flashy. Her power was subtle, exercised through the precise application of social rules and the drawing of invisible, yet utterly impermeable, lines. Her home on Fifth Avenue, a stately brownstone at the corner of 34th Street, wasn't just a house. It was the social epicenter, the very heart of the 400. Honest we'll get to soon. Her life was a meticulously choreographed dance of social engagements. Every year, she hosted a series of grand balls, dinner parties, and receptions that were the absolute gold standard. An invitation to one of Mrs. Astor's events was the ultimate validation, a stamp of approval that declared, "You have arrived. You are one of us." Without it, you were merely a rich person, perhaps, but certainly not a member of society, and she made sure everyone knew it. Her guest lists were curated with an almost scientific precision, ensuring that only the right people, those of established families, impeccable manners, and a suitable amount of inherited wealth, crossed her threshold. Her personality, by all accounts, was formidable. She wasn't prone to outbursts or dramatic displays. Her power lay in her icy composure and her unwavering adherence to tradition. She was the guardian of the old guard, the one who upheld the strict etiquette and unspoken rules that governed their world. If you were a new millionaire who just built a monstrous mansion on Fifth Avenue, you might think your money could buy you anything. But you'd quickly discover that Mrs. Astor was not for sale. Her social currency was far more valuable than mere dollars. One of her signature moves was her annual ball, usually held on a Monday in January. This wasn't just a party, it was an institution. The receiving line was a gauntlet. You had to have the correct clothes, the correct carriage, and, perhaps most importantly, the correct demeanor. Imagine the anxiety of being a young socialite, or a nervous new wife, presenting yourself to Mrs. Astor, hoping for that slight nod of recognition or that brief, polite conversation that could make or break your year. It was the ultimate test, and very few passed with flying colors on their first try unless they were already part of the inner circle. Here's a quirky detail that illustrates the era's obsession with social rituals. Mrs. Astor famously had a very specific way of receiving guests, often standing in a particular spot in her ballroom, almost like a monarch on a throne. Guests would parade past her in a strict order, and she would offer a brief, often one-word greeting, like "How do you do?" or simply a nod. It wasn't about warmth. It was about acknowledging your presence within her domain. And if you weren't on the list, you simply weren't getting in, no matter how much you begged or bribed. It sounds incredibly stiff and formal to us today, but in that world, it was the epitome of refined elegance. However, historians still debate the true extent of Mrs. Astor's personal power. While she was undoubtedly the leader of society, was she merely a symbol, or did she truly micromanage every social interaction and guest list decision? Some argue that her power was largely symbolic, representing the old god's collective resistance, while others maintained she was an active, strategic player in maintaining the social hierarchy. What is clear, however, is that she became the ultimate gatekeeper, the person everyone had to impress, appease, or, as we'll soon see, actively try to outmaneuver if they wanted a place at the top. Her existence created an incredibly clear target for the new money families. They saw her, with her seemingly impenetrable social circle, as the ultimate challenge. If they could get an invitation from Mrs. Esther, if they could be seen at her balls, then they would truly belong. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about status, recognition, and the right to stand shoulder to shoulder with the established elite. And standing in their way, serene and unyielding, was the formidable Mrs. Caroline Astor, guardian of the old order, and keeper of the legendary 400. So, we've established that Mrs. Caroline Astor was the queen bee of New York society. But what exactly was her kingdom? It wasn't a geographical area. It was an exclusive social group, so elite, so coveted, that it became known simply as the 400. Imagine an invisible velvet rope around the very top tier of society, and only 400 people were allowed inside. This wasn't just a casual gathering. It was a deeply ingrained, universally acknowledged list of who mattered in New York. If you weren't on it, you might as well have been invisible to the city's true social elite. The legend goes that the number 400 was not arbitrary. It was famously coined by Ward McAllister, Mrs. Astor's unofficial social secretary and the ultimate arbiter of good taste, at least, according to him and Mrs. Astor. When asked about the maximum number of people who could be considered truly acceptable in New York society, McAllister supposedly declared that there were only about 400 people in New York society. If you go outside that number, you strike people who are either not attractive, or who are not well-bred, or who are not agreeable, or who are not in a position to be in society. And why 400? Well, the most popular and somewhat charming theory, though perhaps a bit apocryphal, is that it was simply the maximum number of people who could fit into Mrs. Astor's grand ballroom at her Fifth Avenue mansion. So, literally, if you couldn't fit in her house, you couldn't fit into society. It's a wonderfully concrete, almost literal, representation of social exclusion. It wasn't about the grandness of the venue. It was about the limited capacity of the ultimate social gatekeeper's personal space. Imagine the absolute frenzy this created. If you were a wealthy New Yorker, your ultimate goal wasn't just to make money. It was to get on that list. It wasn't explicitly published, but everyone knew who was on it. Then more importantly, who wasn't. It was disseminated through whispers, through the guest lists of Mrs. Astor's parties, and through the very specific set of social calls that old money families made to each other. Being in meant everything. Access to the right clubs, the right schools for your children, the right marriage prospects, and ultimately, a sense of belonging at the very apex of American society. For the new money, this list was a constant source of frustration and ambition. They had the wealth, the mansions, the jewels, everything money could buy. But they couldn't buy their way onto the 400. They could throw grander parties, build bigger houses, and wear more diamonds. But if Mrs. Astor didn't deem them acceptable, they remained outside the inner circle, forever labeled as nouveau rich, a term often whispered with a sniff of disdain, implying they lacked breeding, manners, and proper social lineage. The rules for getting onto this list were unwritten but incredibly strict. It wasn't just about wealth, as we've discussed. It was about lineage, about having an acceptable family history, about a certain understated elegance, and, most importantly, about being vouched for by someone already in. You couldn't just throw a lot of money around. In fact, overtly flashy displays of wealth were often seen as a sign of being unworthy of the 400. It was a subtle, almost impenetrable code of conduct that baffled and frustrated the newly rich. Here's a quirky tidbit. The notion of old money being averse to new money was so prevalent that some old money families would discreetly inquire about a potential suitor's or new acquaintance's background, not just their wealth, but how they made it. If it was from something to commercial or dirty, like brewing beer or running a slaughterhouse, even if it made them millions, it could be a strike against them, no matter how refined their manners. Imagine being turned away from a dinner party because your great-grandfather dealt in pig intestines. It sounds absurd, but it illustrates the almost arbitrary nature of some of these social barriers. However, historians still debate the rigidity and the exact composition of the 400. Was it a fixed list, or did it subtly shift over time? Did McAllister truly define it, or was he more of a mouthpiece for Mrs. Astron, the collective sentiment of the old guard? Some scholars argue that while the concept was very real, the actual list was more fluid and less precisely defined than the popular narrative suggests. Nevertheless, the idea of the 400 held immense power, becoming a psychological barrier for those on the outside and a symbol of exclusivity for those within. So, while the new industrialists were busy building literal empires, Mrs. Astor and her cohort were busy building a social empire, an exclusive club whose membership was the most coveted prize in Gilded Age New York. And the battle lines would run. The brash, ambitious, and fabulously wealthy nouveau rich against the serene, tradition-bound, and exclusive old money, with the 400 as the ultimate prize. And the man who helped formalize those invisible rules, setting the stage for the coming social skirmishes, was none other than Ward McAllister himself. Now, we can't talk about Mrs. Astor in the 400 without talking about her shadow, her confidant, and arguably the architect of the social rules that govern Gilded Age New York. Ward McAllister. If Mrs. Astor was the queen, McAllister was certainly her prime minister, her chief of staff, and perhaps even her spin doctor, all rolled into one impeccably dressed package. He was the one who codified the unwritten laws of high society, giving them a formal structure and, in doing so, made himself both indispensable and, at times, insufferably pompous. Imagine a man who took social etiquette as seriously as a general plans a battle. Ward McAllister wasn't born into the absolute zenith of New York cold money, though he came from a respectable Southern family. He was a lawyer by training, but his true genius, and indeed his life's passion, was social engineering. He had an unparalleled understanding of the nuances of high society, its unspoken codes, its intricate pecking orders, and its desperate need for order and exclusion. He positioned himself as the ultimate authority on what was done and, more importantly, what was decidedly not done. His most famous contribution, beyond coining the 400, was his meticulous attention to the rules of social interaction. He essentially wrote the handbook for how to navigate Gilded Age high society, laying out prescriptions for everything from the correct way to host a dinner party down to the number of courses and the appropriate table settings, to the precise method of leaving a calling card. His pronouncements were taken as gospel by those aspiring to social elevation and scoffed at, perhaps, but ultimately obeyed by those already at the top. McAllister published a book in 1890 called Society as I Have Found It, which was less a memoir and more a prescriptive guide to elite living. It became an instant sensation, devoured by both those within the social circle and, perhaps even more eagerly, by those desperate to break in. He meticulously detailed the proper decorum for balls, teas, dinners, and even yacht parties. He was all about separating the wheat from the chaff, ensuring that only those with the right sensibilities and breeding could truly ascend. For the new money, this book was both a Bible and a torture device, a guide to a world they desperately wanted to enter, but whose rules felt arbitrary and designed to exclude them. He was notoriously rigid and snobbish in his pronouncements. For instance, he famously declared that a truly grand dinner party should never exceed 12 people. because more than 12 becomes a crowd, and no one can be truly intimate. He also had very strong opinions on dress, decor, and composition. It was all about cultivated refinement, restraint, and an almost aristocratic disdain for anything loud, garish, or, heaven forbid, new. He believed that truly fashionable people didn't follow trends. They set them, but in an understated, classic way. Here's a quirky McAllister detail. He was obsessed with the idea of blue blood, not just as a metaphor for aristocracy, but almost literally. He believed that the right families possessed an innate refinement that simply could not be acquired through wealth alone. He once suggested that anyone hoping to enter society should be able to trace their lineage back at least 3 generations within the country, and preferably have ancestors who arrived before the revolution. Imagine trying to explain your great-grandfather's humble beginnings as a tailor to Ward McAllister. You'd be instantly relegated to the social dustbin. Historians, however, still debate McAllister's true influence. Was he a genuine power broker, or merely Mrs. Astor's public relations man, articulating her unspoken desires? Some argue that he was more of a caricature, a self-appointed oracle whose pronouncements were sometimes mocked even by those who followed them. Yet there's no denying that his ideas, especially the concept of the 400, became incredibly influential and shaped the aspirations and anxieties of an entire generation of wealthy New Yorkers. He provided a framework, however arbitrary, for understanding the invisible lines that separated the haves from the have-nots in the social sphere. His meticulous rules, while seemingly absurd to us today, served a crucial purpose for the old god. They provided a legitimate-sounding reason to exclude the deluge of new money. It wasn't about simply having more cash. It was about lacking the breeding, the manners, the lineage. It was about failing to understand the complex dance of social calls, the subtle cues of conversation, or the proper way to arrange a bouquet. These rules were the invisible drawbridge of the old money castle, and McAllister was the gatekeeper, deciding who was worthy to cross. But the drawbridge was about to be challenged, not by a polite knock, but by a battering ram of unprecedented wealth and a fierce determination to break through. And the force behind that battering ram was the subject of our next chapter. The incredibly ambitious and incredibly rich new money families, particularly the one whose name would become synonymous with both immense wealth and a brutal social war. The Vanderbilts. Alright, buckle up, because we're about to dive into the family that would eventually shake the very foundations of Gilded Age New York society. The Vanderbilts. Their story is the quintessential rags to riches tale, but with so much money involved it makes your head spin, and a social ambition that was almost terrifying in its intensity. If you wanted to see the epitome of new money, loud and proud, look no further than this formidable clan. The patriarch of the Vanderbilt dynasty was Cornelius Vanderbilt, often called Commodore Vanderbilt. Imagine a man who started with almost nothing but a ferry boat in New York Harbor in the early 19th century. He was gruff, shrewd, often ruthless, and possessed an uncanny knack for business. He built his initial fortune in steamships, pretty much cornering the market on ferry services and coastal shipping. He was so dominant, he earned his famous nickname, Commodore. But he wasn't content with that. He saw the future, and the future was railways. In a move that bewildered many at the time, he systematically sold off his steamship empire and invested heavily in railroads. He didn't just buy a few lines. He consolidated them, creating vast networks, controlling key routes, and eventually dominating the rail traffic in much of the Northeast. He built the Grand Central Depot, the precursor to Grand Central Terminal, and amassed a fortune so enormous it was almost incomprehensible. When he died in 1877, he left behind an estimated $100 million. Now, in today's money, that's roughly equivalent to well over $200 billion. Yes, you heard that right. He was, quite simply, the richest man in America at the time. perhaps even the richest in the world. But here's the rub. For all his staggering wealth and business genius, Commodore Vanderbilt never quite achieved the social acceptance he craved for his family from the established New York elite. He was seen as too crude, too rough-hewn, too new. He didn't care much for fancy balls or meticulous etiquette. His world was about making money and consolidating power. He lived in a relatively modest house by millionaire standards of the day. Anyway, unfamously said, "I have been to a ball once in my life, and that was enough." But while he might not have cared for society himself, his descendants certainly did. His sons and grandsons inherited this colossal fortune, and with it, a burning desire to translate financial power into social prestige. They began building colossal mansions on Fifth Avenue that dwarfed anything the Astors owned. These were not understated brownstones. These were architectural statements. Marble palaces designed to scream WEI or ICH from every turret and gilded window. They filled them with European art, threw extravagant parties, and generally tried to outspend and outdisplay everyone else. The problem? The old guy, led by Mrs. Astor, just rolled their eyes. To them, the Vanderbilts were the epitome of vulgar display, proof that money cowed them by taste or lineage. They might have hundreds of millions, but they were still seen as glorified ferrymen's descendants. Imagine the frustration. You've got more money than God, and you can't get your daughter invited to the right tea party. It's like being the richest kid in the world, but constantly being picked last for dodgeball. One quirky little detail about Commodore Vanderbilt that highlights his disregard for social niceties. He rarely paid attention to his appearance, often wearing old, patched clothes, even when he was one of the richest men in the world. He once reportedly wore a threadbare hat to a meeting where he was negotiating a multi-million-dollar deal, simply because he didn't care about impressing anyone with his attire. This was in stark contrast to the meticulously dressed old money gentleman who wouldn't be caught dead without a perfectly tailored suit and polished shoes. This attitude, while perhaps admirable in its authenticity, certainly didn't help his family or social standing in the eyes of the elite. However, historians still debate whether the Commodore himself truly cared about social acceptance, or if that ambition was purely a desire of his descendants. Some argue that he was simply too focused on business to bother with the trivialities of society, while others suggest that he did feel the sting of exclusion, which then fueled his children's relentless social climb. What's clear is that he provided the financial engine, the monstrous wealth, that would power his family's assault on the social citadel. So, the stage was set. You had the old money, ensconced in their quiet elegance and inherited status. And then you had the Vanderbilts, with their unimaginable wealth, their grand, shouting mansions, and a burning desire to be recognized. They were knocking on the door of society, and for a long time, that door remained firmly, stubbornly shut. But within the Vanderbilt family, there was a woman who possessed not just their characteristic ambition, but also a strategic brilliance that would prove to be a game-changer. She was determined to break down those social barriers, no matter the cost. Her name was Alva Vanderbilt, and she was about to launch the most audacious social assault New York had ever seen. All right, we've introduced the immense wealth of the new industrialists, particularly the Vanderbilts, and the rigid walls of old money society. Now let's truly put ourselves in the shoes of these new rich families as they tried, often desperately, to penetrate the inner sanctum of New York's elite. Imagine having all the money in the world, literally, but still feeling like an outsider, constantly subjected to subtle snubs and polite but firm rejections. This was the ongoing social predicament of the nouveau rich. You see, for all their sprawling mansions, their diamond tiaras, and their private opera boxes, the new money families faced a peculiar kind of ostracism. It wasn't overt hostility, usually. It was far more insidious. It was invisibility. Mrs. Astor and her circle simply acted as if these newly minted millionaires didn't exist, at least not in their social universe. An invitation to Mrs. Astor's annual ball was the ultimate prize, a golden ticket to social legitimacy. Without it, you might as well be throwing your own parties in an empty ballroom. The frustration must have been immense. Imagine hosting a lavish dinner party, sparing no expense on the food, the flowers, the entertainment, only to have the most desirable guests, the old money families, decline with flimsy excuses or, worse, not respond at all. Or perhaps they would send their regrets just hours before, leaving you with an embarrassingly empty seat at a meticulously set table. These weren't just social gaffes. They were calculated slights, designed to send a clear message. You don't belong. The old money families had 1,000 subtle ways of signaling their disapproval. It could be a slight hesitation before extending a hand, a cool, distant gaze, or a polite but vague answer when asked about attending an event. They valued understated elegance over flashy display, quiet decorum over boisterous conversations. For the new money, whose very existence was built on disruption and ambition, these subtle codes were often completely baffling. They didn't understand why buying more diamonds or building a grander house wasn't enough. They thought wealth was status, only to discover that in Mrs. Astor's world, it was merely a prerequisite, and often a strike against you if displayed too overtly. The irony was palpable. These new industrialists were building the very infrastructure that made New York great, financing the growth of the nation, and creating jobs on an unprecedented scale. They were the engines of progress. Yet, in the ballrooms and drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue, they were dismissed as mere upstarts, lacking the refinement and the blood to truly belong. They were often referred to as shoddy gentry, implying their wealth was somehow unearned or inelegant. One particular example of this social quandary revolved around marriage. For the new money, marrying into an old money family was the ultimate symbol of acceptance, a way to buy the pedigree they lacked. And indeed, many such marriages did eventually occur, though often only after years of struggle and persistence. Imagine the emotional toll this took. Parents pushing their children into marriages, not out of love, but purely for social advancement, with the old money families often seeing it as a necessary evil to secure their fading fortunes. It was a transcational system, thinly veiled by polite society. Here's a quirky detail that emphasizes the social gap. Many old money families had specific seating charts at their dinner parties, and if you were new money, you'd often find yourself seated far away from the hosts, perhaps next to a distant cousin or an unmarried aunt. It was a subtle way of indicating your lower social standing, even in a private setting. Imagine paying millions for a house, then being relegated to the children's table of society. The humiliation was real. However, historians often debate the extent to which this new money, old money divide was truly an insurmountable barrier. While some, like the Vanderbilts, were undeniably driven, others might have been more content to simply enjoy their wealth and create their own social circles. Was the social lockout truly absolute, or were there always some pathways, however narrow, for the newly rich to gradually integrate? It's a complex picture, but for many, the sting of rejection was palpable, fueling a fierce determination to break through. This constant exclusion, this invisible wall, eventually led to a tipping point. The new money, particularly one fiery woman named Alva Vanderbilt, simply couldn't stand it anymore. She had the wealth, the ambition, and a formidable will. She was tired of polite snubs and silent judgments. She decided that if the doors to society wouldn't open for her, she would simply kick them down. And she had a plan, a grand, audacious, and outrageously expensive plan that would force even Mrs. Astor to acknowledge the power of the new rich. Her battle was about to begin, and it would be fought, not with armies, but with an invitation list, a custom-built ballroom, and the most spectacular costume ball New York had ever seen. All right, let's meet the woman who would finally throw down the gauntlet and directly challenge Mrs. Caroline Astor's social reign, Alva Erskine Smith Vanderbilt. If the Vanderbilt family was the battering ram of new money, Alva was the sharp, precisely aimed tip of that ram. She was not content to merely be rich. She was determined to be socially recognized, and she was willing to move mountains, or at least construct a few palaces, to achieve it. Imagine a woman of formidable intellect, unshakable will, and a keen strategic mind, wrapped in an exquisite, high-fashion exterior. Alva wasn't born a Vanderbilt. She was born Alva Erskine Smith in Mobile, Alabama, to an old Southern family whose fortunes had diminished after the Civil War. She possessed a sharp wit, an independent spirit, and a deep understanding of the power dynamics of society. When she married William Kissam Vanderbilt, one of Commodore Vanderbilt's grandsons, in 1875, she instantly gained access to an almost unimaginable fortune. But she quickly realized that money alone wasn't enough to buy her way into the exclusive inner circle of New York society, presided over by the unyielding Mrs. Astor. Alva found the constant snubs and polite exclusions infuriating. She saw the old guard's disdain for her family as an insult, not just to their wealth, but to their intelligence and their ambition. She was a woman who didn't take no for an answer, especially when it came to social aspirations. While other new money wives might have quietly simmered with resentment, Alva decided she wasn't going to wait for an invitation. She was going to demand it, or rather, compel it. Her approach was systematic and bold. She understood that if the old money valued lineage and tradition, the new money could counter with sheer scale, unparalleled luxury, and an audacity that could not be ignored. She wasn't interested in simply fitting in. She wanted to dominate. She believed that if she could host an event so spectacularly grand, so undeniably impressive, that it would force Mrs. Astor's hand and make it impossible for her to continue ignoring the Vanderbilt tests. Alva was also a keen observer of human nature and social psychology. She understood that people, even the most snobbish, were ultimately drawn to spectacle and novelty. If she could create a social event that was not just exclusive but also unforgettable, an event that everyone, even Mrs. Astor, would secretly long to attend or at least acknowledge, then she would win. This wasn't just about throwing a party. It was about launching a strategic offensive in the social wars. She started by building a monument to her ambition, the magnificent Vanderbilt mansion at 665th Avenue. This wasn't just a house. It was a French Renaissance chateau, a bona fide palace in the heart of New York, designed by the prestigious firm of Richard Morris Hunt. It cost an astronomical sum. Some estimates put it at $3 million in 1883, which is hundreds of millions today. Took years to build, and featured every imaginable luxury, including a custom-built ballroom. This was a direct architectural challenge to the understated brownstones of the Astors. Here's a quirky detail that speaks to Alva's determination and flair. The Vanderbilt mansion actually had a private art gallery within it, filled with European masterpieces. While other wealthy families collected art, Alva specifically commissioned or acquired pieces that would be impressive to connoisseurs, not just those with deep pockets. She understood that true social cachet wasn't just about spending money, but spending it wisely on things that demonstrated cultural sophistication, something the old money believed the new money lacked. It was a subtle, yet powerful, statement. However, historians still debate whether Alva's ambition was purely about social climbing, or if it also stemmed from a genuine desire to elevate American culture and introduce a new style of gracious living. Was she merely a social climber, or a trailblazer for a more dynamic and less rigid American aristocracy? What's undeniable is that her strategic mind and sheer force of will were instrumental in challenging the existing social order. She wasn't just throwing money at the problem. She was throwing a carefully planned social bomb. So, with her custom-built ballroom ready and her reputation for audacious ambition firmly established, Alva Vanderbilt began to formulate her grand plan. She knew that to truly break into the 400, she needed more than just a grand house. She needed an event that would be so magnificent, so talked about, that even the formidable Mrs. Astor would be forced to take notice, and perhaps even attend. The stage was set for the legendary costume ball, an event that would forever change the landscape of Gilded Age New York society and mark a pivotal moment in the battle between old money and new. All right, Alva Vanderbilt has her colossal French chateau on Fifth Avenue, a house that screams new money with every ornate detail. But a house, no matter how grand, is just a house without a purpose. For Alva, that purpose was clear: to throw the kind of party that would shatter the existing social order. And what better way to do that than by turning her very home into the ultimate weapon in the social wars? For the Gilded Age New Money, their mansions weren't just residences. They were battlegrounds, statements, and ultimately, truth of their arrival. Imagine the absolute frenzy of building during this period. Fifth Avenue was transforming from a street of elegant brownstones into a parade of architectural marvels, each more extravagant than the last. The new millionaires, unable to impress with generations of inherited property, decided to outdo the old guard with sheer scale and opulence. They hired the most renowned architects, imported materials from Europe, and spared no expense in creating homes that were more akin to European palaces than American residences. The Vanderbilt Mansion at 665th Avenue, completed in 1883, was the absolute pinnacle of this architectural arms race. Designed by Richard Morris Hunt, it was a French Gothic chateau, complete with turrets, gargoyles, and an elaborate ballroom that was specifically designed to be the largest and most impressive in New York. While Mrs. Astor lived in a relatively modest by Vanderbilt standards brownstone, Alva was building a fortress of new money, a statement in stone that she was here, and she wasn't going anywhere. These homes weren't just places to live. They were instruments of social warfare. They were designed for grand entertaining, for hosting the kind of elaborate balls and dinners that were the currency of high society. Every detail, from the grand staircase to the marble fireplaces, was meant to impress, to dazzle, and to implicitly ask, "Can your old money match this?" The answer, more often than not, was no. The old money simply didn't need to build such ostentatious displays. Their status was inherent. The new money, however, had to prove theirs. Think about the sheer practicalities of building such a place. It would have involved hundreds of craftsmen, sculptors, painters, and decorators, all working to create a vision of unparalleled luxury. Imported marble, tapestries, furniture, and art filled these vast spaces. It was an economic engine in itself, employing countless people and showcasing the boundless resources of the new industrialists. And every single detail was chosen by Alva with a purpose: to be bigger, better, and more talked about than anything the old guard possessed. One particularly fascinating detail about these mansions: many of them had a dedicated ballroom wing or a purpose-built space explicitly designed for hosting large social events. This was a direct response to the social realities of the time. If you wanted to break into society, you needed to host. And to host grandly, you needed the space. It wasn't just a place for dancing. It was a stage for social triumph or failure. Mrs. Astor's comparatively smaller ballroom was part of the problem for the burgeoning social scene, and Alva was creating a solution that also served as a very direct challenge. However, historians still debate the architectural legacy of these Gilded Age mansions. Were they truly works of art, or merely ostentatious displays of wealth, lacking in true taste or originality? Some argue they were derivative European imitations, while others see them as a distinctively American response to newfound wealth, showcasing the ambitions and aspirations of an era. What's clear is that they were built with a very specific social purpose in mind. So, Alva had her magnificent stage, her palatial mansion with its enormous ballroom. It was a physical manifestation of her family's wealth and ambition. But the grandest stage in the world is useless without a compelling performance. And Alva was about to unleash a performance that would force the hand of even Mrs. Caroline Astor. With the ultimate venue secured, her next move was to craft the rules of engagement, to send out the signals, and to prepare the battlefield for the ultimate social showdown. She knew that to truly win, she needed to control the entire narrative. From the very first invitation to the very last dance, the battle for social dominance was about to shift from polite snubs to a full-blown spectacle. All right, Alva Vanderbilt has her magnificent new mansion, a gleaming statement of new money ambition on Fifth Avenue. But how do you actually use a mansion like that to break into the ultimate social circle? It wasn't about simply sending out a text message or any mail, or even making a phone call. Those were still pretty newfangled and certainly not for formal social invitations. Oh no. In the Gilded Age, the humble calling card was the weapon of choice, and its use was governed by a set of rules so intricate, so bafflingly precise, that it made a chess game look like tic-tac-toe. Imagine this. You've moved into your brand new, multi-million-dollar mansion. You desperately want to be accepted by the old guard. The first step, before you could even think of inviting them to anything, is to make a social call. This involved leaving your calling card, or card visit, at the home of the person you wish to cultivate. But it wasn't just dropping off a piece of paper. It was an elaborate ritual, fraught with hidden meanings and potential pitfalls. Your calling card itself had to be just right. Engraved, not printed, with your full name and your husband's name if you were a married woman. G. Mrs. William Kissam Vanderbilt. It could be plain or perhaps very subtly adorned with a family crest. You'd arrive at the home, usually in a carriage, and present your card to the footman or butler. This is where it gets complicated. If you were a married woman calling on another married woman, you'd leave 3 cards. One for the lady of the house, one for her husband, and one for any adult and married daughter living in the household. If the lady was at home, meaning she was receiving callers, you might be ushered in for a brief, formal conversation. If she wasn't, you simply left the cards. The crucial part was how the cards were folded. A corner folded down meant you delivered it in person. If an entire side was folded, it meant you called on the entire family. If it was a card for a bereavement call, another fold. It was like a secret code only the initiated understood. The whole point of this elaborate dance was to initiate a social exchange. The person receiving the card was then obligated, if they deemed you acceptable, to return the call or send their own cards within a certain time frame, usually a week or 2. If they returned your call, it meant they acknowledged your existence and were open to further social interaction. If they didn't return your call, or if their cards never materialized, it was a polite but utterly devastating snub. It meant you were not welcome, and any further attempts at social climbing would be futile. For the new money, this was a constant source of anxiety. They would send their carefully engraved cards, then wait by the window, hoping to see a carriage from an old money family pull up to their curb. Signaling acceptance, the silence, or the non-return of the card, was deafening. It was a vicious cycle of hopeful outreach and disheartening rejection. They had the grandest homes, but their calling card trays often remained empty of the most coveted names. One particularly quirky rule: if you were calling on a woman who was in mourning, you were supposed to turn down the corner of your card, or even use a special card with a black border to indicate the solemnity of your visit. Imagine the social faux pas of showing up with the wrong card, potentially offending an entire grieving family. It shows how every single detail was scrutinized and imbued with meaning. However, historians still debate how universally these precise rules were followed. even among the old guard. While they were certainly the ideal, daily life might have involved some bending of the rules. Was every single card fold meticulously inspected, or was it more about the general intention in the response? Nevertheless, the perception of these strict rules was certainly real, and they created a powerful barrier for those trying to enter the social fray. Alva Vanderbilt understood this intricate dance. She knew that to break through, she needed to force Mrs. Astor to acknowledge her, not through a calling card, but through a direct challenge that couldn't be ignored. The calling card system was too subtle, too easily manipulated for polite rejection. Alva needed a cannonball, not a whispered note, and her planned costume ball was precisely that cannonball. She was about to bypass the tedious, passive-aggressive ballet of calling cards and force a direct confrontation, an event so spectacular it would make the return of a calling card seem utterly insignificant by comparison. The ultimate social chess match was about to begin, and Alva was ready to play her queen. All right, so the new money is trying to break in, the old money is digging in its heels, and Alva Vanderbilt is plotting her grand assault. But beyond the calling cards and the grand mansions, there was another crucial battleground for social status. Philanthropy. For the Gilded Age elite, whether old or new money, charity wasn't just about altruism. It was a carefully calibrated tool for social positioning, an entry ticket, or sometimes a strategic maneuver in the ongoing social wars. Imagine being fabulously wealthy. You have more money than you could possibly spend, and frankly, a lot of it was accumulated through some pretty ruthless business practices. What do you do with it? Well, besides building palaces and throwing lavish parties, you establish charities, fund museums, endow libraries, and donate to hospitals. This wasn't just about civic duty. It was about public image, about legitimizing your wealth, and for the new money, it was a desperate attempt to gain respectability and acceptance from the old guard. For the old money, philanthropy was often a quiet, dignified affair, a natural extension of their inherited status and a way to maintain their position as community leaders. They had been supporting the city's institutions for generations. Their names were already etched into the cornerstones of hospitals and the plaques of universities. Their giving was seen as an intrinsic part of their social responsibility, a duty passed down through the family. They didn't need to shout about it. Their quiet generosity simply reinforced their already established place at the top. For the new money, however, philanthropy was a different game entirely. It was an investment, a strategic move to buy influence and, hopefully, social cachet. They would pour vast sums into building new opera houses like the Metropolitan Opera, which we'll get to, endowing universities, or establishing public libraries. Their giving was often grander, more visible, and sometimes a little more self-serving in its motivation. They understood that throwing money at a good cause might just earn them a seat on the board of a prestigious institution, putting them in direct contact with the old money families who served on the same boards. Think about the dynamics. An old money lady, Mrs. Astor for instance, might be the head of a major charity ball committee. They knew money why, desperate for an invitation, might offer to underwrite the entire event or make an enormous donation. The old money would accept the money. Of course he wouldn't. But whether that translated into a coveted dinner invitation was another matter entirely. It was a constant push and pull, a dance between accepting much-needed funds and maintaining social distance. The establishment of major cultural institutions during the Gilded Age, like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the American Museum of Natural History, and the Metropolitan Opera, were often the direct result of this philanthropic competition. New money titans like J. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, and the Vanderbilts poured millions into these ventures, creating a lasting legacy that went beyond their personal fortunes. But they also expected something in return, a degree of social recognition that their raw wealth alone couldn't secure. Here's a quirky detail. Some old money families, particularly those with a strong sense of civic duty, would actually quietly resent the new money's flashy philanthropic efforts. They saw it as vulgar display, or worse, as an attempt to buy respectability that hadn't been earned through generations of service. It wasn't enough to give. You had to give with the right motivations, and the right level of understated grace. Imagine being criticized for giving away too much money too loudly. It sounds absurd, but it highlights the peculiar social prejudices of the time. However, historians still debate the true motivations behind Gilded Age philanthropy. Was it genuinely altruistic, or largely self-serving? While the social climbing aspect was undeniable, many of these philanthropists also had a genuine desire to improve society and leave a lasting legacy. It's a complex interplay of motivations, but for our story, the key is how philanthropy became a tool in the social war, a way for the new money to try and gain a foothold in the old guard's exclusive world. So, while the new money was strategically using their immense fortunes to fund grand public works, hoping to gain entry into the old guard's social sphere, the old guard remained largely unmoved in their core social circles. They would accept the money, but often keep their distance. But there was one institution, one grand building that became an absolute focal point for this social conflict, a place where the old and new money would clash, not in a ballroom, but in opera boxes, vying for the ultimate display of social dominance. That place was the Metropolitan Opera House, and it was about to become the site of a very public, very melodramatic social battle. All right, we've covered philanthropy as a strategic tool for social climbing. But for the truly dramatic clash between old money and new, there was no better arena than the grand, gilded boxes of the Metropolitan Opera House. This wasn't just a place to enjoy music. It was the ultimate public stage for social display, a battleground where fortunes and reputations were made or broken with every curtain rise. Imagine a setting where wealth was literally on display. The original Metropolitan Opera House, which opened in 1883, was nicknamed the Yellow Brick Brewery due to its somewhat uninspired exterior. But inside it was a different story. It was designed to accommodate the city's elite, with rows of private boxes that were essentially mini drawing rooms. These boxes weren't just seats. They were social real estate, passed down through families, coveted, and meticulously decorated. They were where you saw and were seen. The problem was, the old, established Academy of Music Opera House was simply too small. Its boxes were owned by the old money families, and they weren't selling. So the new money, primarily a consortium of Vanderbilts, Morgans, and other newly rich industrialists, decided to build their own opera house. They poured millions into the Met, creating a grander, more spacious venue with more boxes, specifically to make room for themselves. It was a direct challenge to the old guard's control of culture and a very public declaration of their economic power. On opening night, the social lines were stark. The old money families remained loyal to the Academy of Music, clinging to their inherited boxes and traditions. Meanwhile, the new money families, resplendent in their finest jewels and couture, filled the luxurious boxes of the new Met. It was a grand, almost theatrical demonstration of the social divide. You could literally look across the tiers and see the two factions, side by side, yet worlds apart. The opera, therefore, became less about the music and more about the spectacle of society itself. During intermissions, people didn't just walk to the lobby. They paraded around the diamond horseshoe, the curving promenade behind the boxes, hoping to catch the eye of someone important or to make a subtle display of their latest diamonds. The opera glasses weren't just for viewing the stage. They were for scrutinizing other attendees, judging their attire, their companions, and their social standing. It was a living, breathing fashion show and social hierarchy display rolled into one. The placement of your box at the Met was crucial. The best boxes, closest to the stage and in the most visible locations, were the most coveted. They were reserved for the titans of industry and their families. To have a box at the Met was to announce your presence among the city's elite. For the new money, it was a symbolic victory, a place where they could finally stand on somewhat equal footing, at least architecturally, with the old guard. Here's a quirky detail. The private boxes at the Met were designed not just for viewing, but for entertaining. Some had small parlors attached, where families could receive guests between acts, almost like having a mini drawing room at the opera. Imagine the subtle power plays during these intermissions. Which guests were invited into which boxes, who received a nod, and who was pointedly ignored. It was all part of the intricate social ballet. However, historians still debate the ultimate impact of the Met on social mobility. While it provided a new space for the new money to congregate and display their wealth, did it truly break down the old money's social barriers, or merely create a parallel society? Some argue that the Met eventually became a common ground where the two groups slowly began to mingle, while others contend that the divide persisted, even within the Opera House, for many years. It was a significant step, but not the final one. So, while the Met offered a grand stage for the new money to assert their financial power, the ultimate social gatekeeper, Mrs. Astors, still held sway over the most exclusive private invitations. The Opera House provided a public platform, but the battle for true intimacy and acceptance within the old guard's inner circle remained Alva Vanderbilt's ultimate challenge. And as she watched the social drama unfold from her own luxurious box, she knew that to truly win the war, she needed an event that was so spectacular, so irresistible, that it would force Mrs. Astors to cross the threshold of her house and step into her world, once and for all. The seeds for the legendary costume ball were being sown, and the Opera House had merely been the dress rehearsal. All right, Alva Vanderbilt has her brilliant plan for the costume ball, aiming to shatter New York's social glass ceiling. But a brilliant plan needs meticulous execution, especially when you're going to host the most talked about event of the Gilded Age. The preparations for this grand affair weren't just about hiring caterers. They were about orchestrating a symphony of extravagance, demonstrating unparalleled wealth, and ensuring every single detail screamed Vanderbilt has arrived. Imagine the sheer scale of the undertaking. Alva literally poured her vast resources, and those of her husband, William, into making this ball an unprecedented spectacle. The estimates of the cost vary, but they generally range from $0 to $0 in 1883 dollars. To put that in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to anywhere from $7 million to $12 million today. For a single party, this wasn't just throwing money around. It was a deliberate, strategic investment in social prestige. The first step was, of course, the costumes. A costume ball meant guests needed elaborate, often historically accurate, and incredibly expensive outfits. Alva set the standard by commissioning her own costume to be Lady of Venice, a truly opulent gown designed by the famous French couturier Worth. Her daughter, Consuelo, would be a shepherdess, though a very grand one. These weren't off-the-rack outfits. They were bespoke creations, often requiring months of work and imported fabrics, jewels, and trims. Imagine the frantic rush in tailor shops and jewelers across New York and even in Paris as the socialites prepared their elaborate disguises. And there was the food. Alva didn't just order a few trays of canapes. She hired the most renowned caterers, planning a menu that would feed over 1,000 guests with multiple courses, exotic fruits a huge luxury at the time, and an endless supply of champagne. The Vanderbilt mansion's kitchens, already massive, would have been working overtime, preparing culinary masterpieces for a truly discerning crowd. This wasn't about sustenance. It was about culinary artistry and a demonstration of limitless hospitality. The decorations transformed the magnificent chateau into an even more fantastical realm. The ballroom, specifically built for such grand events, was adorned with thousands of flowers, tropical plants, and intricate lighting. Imagine entering a space that looked like a magical forest or a scene from a fairy tale, all designed to transport guests into a world of pure fantasy and luxury. Every corner of the house, from the grand staircase to the reception halls, would have been meticulously decorated to enhance the costume theme and create an immersive experience. And of course, the music. Alva hired multiple orchestras and bands to provide a continuous flow of music for dancing throughout the night. This wasn't just background noise. It was essential for creating the lively, celebratory atmosphere that would keep guests entertained and dancing until the early hours of the morning. The logistics alone, managing hundreds of staff, coordinating deliveries, ensuring everything was perfect, must have been a monumental task. One quirky detail that showcases the extravagance. Alva had an entire wall of the ballroom transformed into a mock-up of the Grand Canal in Venice, complete with actual gondolas and gondoliers. Imagine the surprise and delight of guests walking into a ballroom to find a miniature Venetian canal. It was an audacious display of creativity and wealth, designed to be utterly unforgettable and to demonstrate a level of imagination that few could match. However, historians still debate the exact figures for the ball's cost. While the numbers reported are incredibly high, some scholars suggest the exact amount might have been exaggerated for dramatic effect or to further cement the Vanderbilt's reputation for limitless wealth. Nevertheless, even conservative estimates confirm it was an astronomical sum for a single private event. So, the stage was set, the costumes were being sewn, the champagne was chilling, and the culinary team was preparing for the gastronomic event of the century. Alva Vanderbilt was leaving absolutely nothing to chance. Every dollar spent, every detail planned, was a calculated step in her grand social strategy. But for all the extravagance and meticulous planning, the ultimate success of the ball hinged on one critical element: the guest list, and specifically, the presence of one particular, very important guest. The invitations were about to go out, and with them, the ultimate test of Alva's social power. All right, the moment of truth has arrived. All the meticulous planning, the strategic maneuvers, and the sheer extravagance have culminated in this one night. March 26, Yobarbasen, the night of Alva Vanderbilt's legendary costume ball. Imagine the air crackling with anticipation, not just among the guests, but throughout all of New York society. This wasn't just a party, it was a phenomenon, a live spectacle of wealth and ambition. You, as an invited guest, would have arrived at the magnificent Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue, your carriage pulling up amidst a throng of other ornate conveyances. The streets would be aglow with gaslight, and probably lined with curious onlookers, eager to catch a glimpse of the city's elite in their fantastical attire. As you stepped out, you'd be enveloped by the buzz of excitement and the faint strains of music drifting from within. The entrance itself was an experience. Imagine walking into a literal palace. The grand staircase, famously one of the most magnificent in New York, would have been draped with exotic flowers and greenery. Livered footmen, looking perhaps a bit like figures from a Renaissance painting themselves, would greet you. The air would be thick with the scent of lilies and roses, mingled with the subtle perfume of expensive silks and furs. Then, the costumes. Oh, the costumes. This was the heart of the spectacle. Guests had spent fortunes and months creating their elaborate disguises. You would see figures from history, mythology, and literature come to life. Cleopatra lounging with Mark Antony, Marie Antoinette exchanging pleasantries with a medieval knight, Venetian doges mingling with figures from Greek mythology. There were jesters, queens, kings, and fantastical creatures, all vying for the prize of the most original and opulent costume. Alva Vanderbilt herself was a vision, embodying her chosen persona of a Venetian princess, adorned in pearls and jewels. Her daughter, Consuelo, made her debut as a shepherdess, though a remarkably jeweled and delicate one. The goal was not just to dress up, but to transform oneself, to become a living work of art that night. The attention to detail, the richness of the fabrics, and the sparkle of the diamonds would have been overwhelming. The main event, of course, was the ballroom. Alva's purpose-built ballroom was indeed the largest and most magnificent in New York. Imagine stepping into a vast, glittering space, filled with thousands of flowers, soft lighting, and the sounds of a full orchestra playing waltzes and quadrilles. The centerpiece was the famous Grand Canal of Venice tableau, where guests could actually see gondolas floating on a mini canal, complete with gondoliers. It was utterly breathtaking, a complete immersion into a world of fantasy and unparalleled luxury. Dinner was a series of lavish courses, served on exquisite china, accompanied by the finest wines and champagne. The sheer number of servants employed for the night would have been staggering, ensuring that every guest's swim was catered to with effortless grace. Later in the evening, as the dancing continued, a midnight supper was served, offering yet another opportunity for culinary indulgence and social mingling. Here's a quirky detail that illustrates the era's fascination with elaborate entertainment. At one point during the ball, a famous stage actress, playing the role of a mythological figure, made a dramatic entrance from a hidden part of the ballroom, performing a short, theatrical piece. It added another layer of performance and spectacle, turning the ball into something more akin to a grand opera itself, designed to keep guests enthralled and to be utterly unforgettable. However, historians still debate the precise atmosphere of the ball. While accounts universally describe its opulence, some suggest that beneath the glittering surface, there was still an undercurrent of social tension, particularly as the old guard mingled, often reluctantly, with the new. Was it a truly harmonious gathering, or a forced display of civility? Nevertheless, the sheer spectacle and the undeniable presence of both factions in one room made it a landmark event. As the night wore on, the impact became clear. The sheer grandeur of the ball, the unprecedented luxury, and the sheer number of important guests including, crucially, Carrie Astor, made it impossible for the old guard to ignore. Alva Vanderbilt had thrown a party that was not just exclusive, but irresistible. She had forced her way into the center of New York society, not by polite request, but by sheer, overwhelming spectacle. The social walls, once so rigid, had not just cracked. They had been undeniably, spectacularly breached. The next morning, New York would wake up to a new social order, thanks to Alva's masterstroke. All right, the Alva Vanderbilt Ball was a triumph, a spectacle that forced the new money into the old guard's exclusive circle. But how did Mrs. Caroline Astor, the Queen herself, react to this audacious challenge? This was her world, her carefully constructed 400 that Alva had just so spectacularly breached. Her response, while perhaps not dramatic in the way a modern reality TV show might portray it, was a significant moment of concession, marking the turning point in her reign. Imagine Mrs. Astor, after days of deliberating and undoubtedly consulting with her trusted social advisor Ward McAllister. She was the matriarch, the arbiter of taste, the one who had stubbornly kept the Vanderbilts and their vulgar wealth at arm's length for years. To acknowledge them, even indirectly, was to concede a battle she had fought tooth and nail. But Alva's strategy had left her little choice. The fact that Mrs. Astor sent her own daughter, Terry, to the ball was the key. It was a silent, yet powerful, surrender. By allowing her daughter to attend, Mrs. Astor implicitly acknowledged the social importance of the Vanderbilt Ball. To have kept Carrie home would have been a public snub, not just to Alva, but to her own daughter's social standing. It would have isolated Carrie from the most talked-about event, making her seem socially irrelevant. Mrs. Astor, for all her snobbery, was a pragmatist when it came to her family's position. It's often recounted that shortly after the ball, or perhaps in the weeks following, Mrs. Astor finally made that long-awaited social call Alva Vanderbilt. This single act was monumental. It signified her official recognition of the Vanderbilts as a legitimate force within New York society. It was the formal opening of the doors that had been firmly shut for so long. Imagine the satisfaction for Alva, seeing Mrs. Astors' carriage pull up to her mansion, knowing she had finally won this particular, intensely personal battle. This wasn't a complete surrender. Mind you, Mrs. Astor didn't suddenly become best friends with Alva, nor did she start inviting every new millionaire to her weekly teas. Her concessions were gradual and often pragmatic. She was adapting to a changing social landscape, recognizing that the sheer volume of new wealth and the determination of figures like Alva simply could not be ignored indefinitely. Her 400 would inevitably have to expand, or risk becoming obsolete. Mrs. Astor's power had always relied on her ability to dictate who belonged and who didn't. By forcing her to acknowledge the Vanderbilts, Alva effectively diluted that power. It showed that money, when wielded with strategic brilliance and audacious ambition, could indeed challenge inherited status. The Queen had been forced to share her throne, at least in part. Here's a quirky detail that reflects Mrs. Astor's personality. Even after conceding, she maintained her imperious demeanor. It said that she still preferred her own, more understated balls and continued to host them with her signature quiet elegance. She accepted the new reality, but she didn't necessarily embrace it with open arms. Imagine her stiff-lipped politeness when finally meeting Alva, a masterclass in controlled disdain. However, historians still debate the speed and willingness of Mrs. Astor's acceptance. Was it truly a grudging surrender, or was she already feeling the pressure and looking for an opportune moment to gracefully expand her social circle? Some argue that society was always more fluid than it seemed, and the Astor-Vanderbilt dynamic was simply a particularly high-profile example of ongoing social shifts. Nevertheless, the narrative of Mrs. Astor's defeat and Alva's victory became firmly established in the public imagination, symbolizing the changing times. So Mrs. Astor's reluctant but undeniable acknowledgement of the Vanderbilts marked a pivotal moment. The old guard had been forced to yield, creating a significant crack in the social barrier they had so meticulously maintained. The 400 was no longer an entirely rigid number. It was beginning to show signs of expansion, grudgingly making room for new blood. The social wars of Gilded Age New York were from over. But the most important battle, the one that proved the old guard was not invincible, had been decisively won by the forces of new money and strategic ambition. The social landscape of New York was irrevocably changed, opening the door for a slow but steady integration of the new into the old. All right, the social wall is cracked, thanks to Alva Vanderbilt's audacious pull. And with that crack came an inevitable consequence. The legendary 400 list, once the sacred roster of New York's absolute elite, began its slow, inevitable evolution. It didn't vanish overnight, but its meaning and exclusivity gradually eroded, much to the chagrin of the staunchest old money purists. Imagine the discomfort for Ward McAllister and Mrs. Astor. Their carefully curated list, supposedly representing the absolute pinnacle of New York society, was suddenly under immense pressure. With the Vanderbilts firmly entrenched, and other new money families slowly but surely building their own social empires and forging strategic alliances, maintaining a rigid 400-person limit became increasingly unrealistic and, frankly, unsustainable. The first way the 400 began to evolve was simply through sheer necessity. There were simply more wealthy, influential people in New York than could fit into Mrs. Astor's ballroom, or indeed, into a single, highly exclusive list. The city was booming, and new fortunes continued to accumulate. To ignore these new players entirely would be to operate in an increasingly isolated bubble. Secondly, intermarriage played a huge role. As daughters of new money married sons of old money and vice versa, though less frequently from the old money side, the lines blurred. When a Vanderbilt married into a European aristocratic family, or an Astor descendant married into a rich industrial family. It created new social connections that transcended the old rigid classifications. These unions were powerful bridges, slowly eroding the concept of pure old blood. The concept of society itself began to broaden. While Mrs. Astor's 400 focused almost exclusively on inherited wealth and social lineage, the Gilded Age brought new forms of influence. Financiers like J. Clear, Morgan, even if from established families, wielded immense power through their control of capital. Political figures, celebrated artists, and even leading academics began to gain social recognition, sometimes even if their family trees weren't impeccably old. The sheer dynamism of American life meant that a society based purely on a narrow definition of breeding was no longer tenable. Ward McCollister, the very man who coined the term, actually saw his influence wane as the Gilded Age progressed. His rigid rules and pronouncements started to seem increasingly out of touch with the changing social landscape. The 400 became less a definitive list and more a historical relic, a symbol of a bygone era when one woman could supposedly dictate who belonged and who didn't. Here is a quirky detail that shows the changing times. As the 400 became less relevant, society pages in newspapers became increasingly popular. These columns, often filled with gossip and details of lavish parties, inadvertently helped to democratize social access, allowing a wider public to peer into the lives of the elite. While still exclusive, it wasn't the same kind of hidden, invite-only world. You might not be at the party, but you could read all about it. However, historians still debate the exact moment or reason for the decline of the 400. Was it a direct result of the Vanderbilt ball, or was it an inevitable outcome of broader demographic and economic changes in New York? Some argue that while the term persisted, its practical application faded as society became too large and complex to be governed by a single list or a single arbiter. It wasn't abolished, it simply became less meaningful. So the once sacred 400 began to fade into legend. It never truly disappeared from the lexicon of Gilded Age New York, but its power as the ultimate gatekeeper slowly diminished. The social order became more complex, more fluid, and certainly more populated than just 400 souls. The old guard, while still influential, found themselves sharing the top tiers of society with the descendants of those very new money families they had once scorned. The social wars didn't end with a definitive surrender, but with a gradual, undeniable absorption, proving that even the most rigid social structures are ultimately subject to the relentless march of economic change and human ambition. All right, we focused heavily on New York, the undeniable epicenter of the Gilded Age social wars. But it's important to remember that this clash between old money and new wasn't just a Manhattan phenomenon. No, similar social skirmishes, albeit on a slightly smaller scale, were playing out in burgeoning cities across the United States. Imagine the same dynamics, the same snobbery, and the same audacious social climbing, just replicated in different regional flavors. You see, the Industrial Revolution was a national phenomenon. Fortunes were being made in Pittsburgh with steel, in Chicago with meatpacking and railroads, in Boston with textiles and banking, and in San Francisco with gold and railroads. Each of these cities developed its own elite, its own set of old guard families who had established themselves over generations, and its own influx of brash, newly minted millionaires. Take Chicago, for example. There, the old money might have been families who had made their fortunes in lumber, grain, or early real estate. Then came the meatpacking barons like the Armours and Swifts, or the railroad magnates. They built lavish mansions along the Gold Coast of Lakeshore Drive, threw extravagant parties, and tried to break into the established social circles. The resistance they faced would have mirrored that in New York, with the old families scoffing at their bloody money literally, in the case of meatpackers, and their perceived lack of refinement. In Boston, the Boston Bromins, descendants of old merchant and shipping families, were incredibly proud of their intellectual and cultural heritage. They valued understated elegance and academic pursuits over overt displays of wealth. When new industrialists or Western railroad magnates tried to break in, they were met with a very particular kind of Bostonian disdain, a quiet but firm intellectual snobbery that was perhaps even more potent than New York's social exclusion. It wasn't just about your money. It was about your mind, your university, and your family's history of public service. Even emerging cities like San Francisco, which saw a massive influx of wealth from the California gold rush and the Transcontinental Railroad, a social hierarchy quickly formed. The big four railroad barons Leland Stanford, Carlos B. Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker were incredibly rich, but initially faced resistance from the city's older, more established families. They too built their grand mansions on Nob Hill, trying to outdo each other in conspicuous consumption and vying for social acceptance. The patterns were remarkably similar. Old money clinging to tradition, new money trying to buy or force its way in. Elaborate social rituals, though perhaps not as famously codified as New York's 400, and a general tension between inherited status and newly acquired wealth. The nuances would differ. The specific industries, the local traditions, the prevailing cultural values, but the core conflict was universal. Here's a quirky detail that emphasizes regional differences. In some southern cities, where the old money was often based on plantations and the pre-Civil War aristocracy, the new money might have come from tobacco, textiles, or post-war reconstruction. The social dynamics there would have been overlaid with complex racial and historical elements, creating an even more intricate web of social exclusion and aspiration, distinct from the northern industrialist narrative. Imagine the weight of history in those social interactions. However, historians still debate whether the social struggles in these other cities were as intense or as widely documented as those in New York. New York, with its unparalleled concentration of wealth and media attention, certainly became the most prominent stage for this drama. But it's important to acknowledge that the Gilded Age was a nationwide phenomenon, and the social anxieties and aspirations it generated were felt from coast to coast. So, while New York provided the ultimate, most dazzling backdrop for the old money versus new money social wars, similar battles were being waged in parlors and ballrooms across the American landscape. The stories of exclusion, ambition, and eventual, often grudging, integration were playing out in countless cities, each with its own specific cast of characters and its own unique set of social rules. The Gilded Age was truly an era of seismic social shifts, fundamentally reshaping American society and laying the groundwork for the class distinctions that would persist for generations. All right, we've journeyed through the glittering, often tense world of Gilded Age New York, witnessing the clash between old money and new, culminating in Alva Vanderbilt's famous triumph. But like all eras, the Gilded Age, with its unique social order, eventually had to fade. The sun set not with a sudden dramatic collapse, but with a gradual, almost imperceptible shift, as the forces that defined it began to wane. Imagine the turn of the 20th century. The wild, untamed accumulation of fortunes from raw industries like railroads and oil began to stabilize. The Gilded Age millionaires, the Carnegies and Rockefellers, either passed away, retired, or turned their attention from aggressive wealth accumulation to large-scale philanthropy, creating the foundations for modern charitable trusts and foundations. The intense, often brutal, competition of the early industrial era gave way to larger, more regulated corporations. The sheer scale of wealth concentration, while still vast, was no longer quite as shocking or new. The new money of the 1882 and 92 gradually became the established money of the early 1900s. The children and grandchildren of the first generation of industrialists were born into privilege, attending the right schools, marrying into the right families, sometimes even those very old money families who had once scorned their grandparents, and adopting the more refined manners that had been lacking in their ancestors. The distinction between old and new money began to blur significantly over generations. Think about the societal changes that contributed to this fading. The Progressive Era, with its focus on social reform, antitrust legislation, and addressing inequalities, gradually began to challenge the unchecked power and conspicuous consumption of the Gilded Age elite. The robber barons were increasingly scrutinized, and the idea of immense, untaxed fortunes began to face public criticism. World War I, while still a few years away, would also deliver a decisive blow to the European aristocratic model that much of Gilded Age society had emulated. The war would reshape global power dynamics, diminish the prestige of inherited titles, and further push American society towards a more meritocratic, or at least less overtly class-based, ideal in theory. Anyway, the rise of mass media, like popular magazines and eventually radio, also played a part. The exclusive, whispered world of society became more accessible to the general public. Celebrity culture, not just based on lineage but on achievement or even notoriety, began to emerge, further diluting the power of a handful of social arbiters. The 400 became a quaint historical anecdote rather than a living, breathing list. Here's a quirky detail that symbolizes the shift. As society became less rigidly structured, the elaborate, multi-course formal dinners that were once the hallmark of elite entertaining began to give way to slightly less formal, though still elegant, gatherings. The pressure to adhere to every single precise rule of etiquette lessened, reflecting a subtle but definite loosening of social strictures. People were still rich, but the performance of wealth became slightly less theatrical. However, historians still debate the exact end date of the Gilded Age and the specific reasons for its decline. Was it merely an inevitable phase in America's economic development, or were there specific cultural and political forces that actively dismantled its social structures? Some argue that the values of the Gilded Age merely evolved, rather than truly disappearing, subtly influencing subsequent generations of American elites. So the sun slowly set on the Gilded Age. The era of raw, naked social warfare, fought with invitations on dinner parties, began to recede into history. The lessons learned, the fortunes integrated, and the social structures subtly reshaped would continue to reverberate through American society. The dramatic clash between the old and the new gave way to a more blended, though still hierarchical, social order. The questions of class, status, and the pursuit of acceptance, however, would continue to echo, shaping the American experience for decades to come, bringing us closer to the modern world we inhabit today. All right, we've journeyed through the glittering, sometimes ridiculous, and utterly fascinating world of Gilded Age New York. We've seen the grand mansions rise, the social battles fought with going cards and costume balls, and the stubborn old guard finally forced to concede a sliver of their power. But as the gas lights flickered out on that opulent era, what truly remains? How did this wild, dramatic period shape the very fabric of American society and culture, right down to the modern day? Imagine peeling back the thin gold leaf of the Gilded Age. What we find beneath isn't just a dusty old history book. It's the blueprint for much of what we still understand about wealth, class, and social status in America. The terms old money and new money aren't just quaint historical phrases. They were forged in the crucible of the Gilded Age, defined by the very struggles between families like the Astors and the Vanderbilts. Even now, when someone refers to a socialite or a robber baron, they're unconsciously echoing the characters and archetypes perfected during this era. The Gilded Age solidified the idea of a distinct, albeit constantly shifting, American upper class. Before, wealth was often more dispersed, or tied to land. This period saw the explosive concentration of fortunes on an unprecedented scale, leading to the creation of veritable dynasties. While America famously lacks a formal aristocracy with titles and inherited landholdings, the Gilded Age saw the birth of something functionally similar. Families whose wealth, power, and social standing became generational, creating a de facto American nobility. Think of the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Vanderbilts. Their names are still synonymous with immense wealth and lasting influence, centuries after their patriarchs started. This era also deeply ingrained the concept of conspicuous consumption. However, Vanderbilt's custom ball wasn't just a party. It was a masterclass in showing off. The Gilded Age was all about overt luxury, about building the biggest house, wearing the biggest diamonds, and hosting the most extravagant parties, all to signal your wealth and power. You couldn't be subtle when you were trying to break into a closed circle. This legacy of luxury display echoes in today's fascination with designer brands, celebrity mansions, and supercar collections. It's the look at me, I've arrived mentality that Alva perfected. Conversely, the old money's initial disdain for this overt display, their preference for understated elegance and inherited traditions, laid the groundwork for what we now call stealth wealth. The idea that true class doesn't need to shout, that quality speaks for itself, and that inherited possessions like a quiet brownstone or antique silverware are superior to newly bought ones. That's a direct lineage from the Astors and their preference for quiet, dignified living over flashy display. So, whether you prefer to subtly show off your wealth or loudly announce it, both approaches have their roots in this incredible period. And remember those strategic philanthropic endeavors. The Gilded Age laid the foundation for modern philanthropy as we know it. Men like Andrew Carnegie, who famously believed in the gospel of wealth, the idea that the rich had a moral obligation to give back, and families like the Vanderbilts who endowed universities and built museums, transformed private fortunes into public good. While some of it was undoubtedly driven by social climbing or guilt, it left an incredible legacy of cultural and educational institutions that benefit us today. From grand university buildings to public libraries, the fingerprints of Gilded Age philanthropy are everywhere. The human desire for social status, that relentless drive to belong and be recognized, hasn't changed much either. The ballrooms and calling cards might be gone, replaced by exclusive social media circles, elite private schools, and invitation-only tech conferences. But the underlying dynamic remains. The constant aspiration to move up, to gain acceptance from those perceived to be at the top, and the subtle, sometimes cruel, ways in which social barriers are maintained and reinforced. The battle for who sits at the right table, whether it's at a Gilded Age dinner party or a modern-day VIP lounge, is a timeless human drama. One quirky echo of the Gilded Age today. Many old money families, even those whose fortunes have dwindled somewhat, still cling to certain sartorial or lifestyle choices that subtly distinguish them. Think about the classic, slightly worn tweed jacket, the heirloom pearls that are never too flashy, or the summer homes in established enclaves like Martha's Vineyard or the Hamptons that are bought not to be seen, but simply to be. It's a quiet continuation of the old guard's subtle signals, a nod to a heritage that speaks louder than any brand new yacht. However, historians still debate the ultimate long-term impact of the Gilded Age on American social mobility. Did it create an insurmountable class system? Or did it merely accelerate the natural churn of wealth and power in a capitalist society? Some argue that while the initial barriers were high, the American spirit of opportunity eventually allowed for greater social fluidity than in older European societies. Others contend that the Gilded Age merely established new, equally formidable barriers, replacing inherited titles with inherited capital, and setting the stage for persistent social inequality. It's a complex legacy, still unpicking its threads in today's society. So as we close the book on this extraordinary chapter of history, remember that the Gilded Age was just about top hats and ball gowns. It was a crucible where modern American class, wealth, and social dynamics were forged. The echoes of those social wars, The whispers of old money and the shouts of new continue to reverberate through our culture, shaping our aspirations, our judgments, and our understanding of what it means to truly arrive. Now, as the stories of glittering ballrooms and quiet old brownstones begin to softly fade, letting the sounds of horse-drawn carriages and the rustle of silk gowns gently drift away into the quiet of the night, you might find yourself slipping into that wonderfully hazy space between wake arsenals and dreams. The grand ambitions of the Vanderbilts, the steadfast pride of the Astors, and all the meticulously planned social maneuvers are now just echoes, gentle whispers on the edges of your mind. Let the light from the gas lamps dim completely, and the distant strains of a Gilded Age waltz become nothing more than a soft, rhythmic lull. Your own story, the quiet comfort of your bed, is now taking precedence. There's no need to worry about calling cards or dress codes here. Just the peaceful expanse of your own sleep. Feel the day's lingering thoughts unwinding, loosening their grip, much like the rigid corsets of those society ladies finally coming undone at dawn. The pursuit of status, the clash of worlds, all that dramatic energy now settles into a calm, still pool. You are safe. You are one. And the only invitation you truly need tonight is the one to deep, restorative slumber. Let yourself float away on the quiet currents of the night, carrying the faint, beautiful echoes of history with you into your dreams. Rest now, truly rest. The end of the article. Good night.